Hear ye, hear ye! January 21st, 2025 will be the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism. It was the Anabaptist movement, and so one date is not appropriate to pinpoint the beginnings of a movement. Rather, the dates range from 1517 to 1536, and the poems that I will be reading reflect this range of dates of the origins of the Anabaptist movement. Let me first introduce you to myself by telling you my own story in spoken word form of how I became an Anabaptist. How I became an Anabaptist. I grew up a prairie boy, I grew up rural, I grew up separate, I grew up sheltered, I grew up Low German, I grew up in the church, I grew up conservative, I grew up evangelical, I grew up Mennonite. In school they called me a Nazi, in school they called me a kraut, in school they called me a Mennonite. I wanted out. All the words meant the same to me, and it wasn't pleasant. I did not want to be a Mennonite. Did I know what it meant? Not a mite. Mennonites have bled, Mennonites have fled, Mennonites have become Alliance and Baptist and Pentecostal instead. I didn't want to bleed, I couldn't flee. There were no other churches in my community. I had no options. I left my church, I left my parents' faith, I left my Jesus. But Jesus did not leave me. My parents prayed for me. I returned to Jesus, but I thought, it really bites, this thing about being Mennonite. And I had never even heard of being Anabaptist. I wrote this in my journal at the age of 16. Ed Weeb, another preacher, came to see me about baptism into the Mennonite church. I told him no bloody way. I wasn't even a good Christian, and I told him the church didn't seem very attractive because many members were backslidden and it was too dry. He was a little hurt and asked if I needed any spiritual help. I said no, even though I did at the time. I still can't stand help from preachers. I still can't understand some. Well, I've swallowed my words, I've swallowed my pride, my old self has died. For 40 years now, a Mennonite minister, I've been bona fide. Now I'm one of those hard to understand preachers. I chose then and I choose now to be called Mennonite. My sister, she's not a Mennonite even though she eats Varaniki. My pastor, she is a Mennonite even though she's a Yamasaki. How did it happen? How did I become Anabaptist, a theological movement? How did I become Mennonite, a church of the movement? So, back to my youth, I was pretty uncouth. I flirted with a lot of churches. They seemed like so much more fun than my old Mennonite one. What a shock! What a surprise! It was in public university that my faith had a reprise. Christians were ridiculed as right-wing Republican warmongers, but Mennonites were known as nonviolent peacemakers. It's an offense, it doesn't make sense, but I had an opportunity. I shared the Jesus story, I shared my story. My own faith came alive when I told it. Maybe I should be more bold in telling it. Then in my research at the library of Conrad Grebel University, by the way, did you know they named their university after someone who went to 4 universities, got kicked out of one, dropped out of another, and never graduated from any of them? And in my research at an evangelical seminary and at an ecumenical seminary. Too much seminary. I found out Anabaptists were sometimes somewhat contrary. As one who likes to roam, that made me feel right at home. In 1990, my Mennonite world blew up, expanded, when 20,000 Mennonites from all parts of the world descended on Winnipeg. We shook our leg, we ate the bread, we drank the dreg. More Mennos in Africa than Canada? I thought I died and went to heaven. Communion bread was multiplied without the leaven. Then in 2010, there was another phenomenon. A non-Mennonite Brit named Stuart Murray wrote a book. Who is this crook? Should we have a look? In 2011, I went to England to have my look. In person? Ah, it's a naked Anabaptist! Should we pass the fist instead? He took off our centuries-old clothes and I suppose dressed us in those of postmodernism. Postmodernism? I'm scared of isms. Communism, fascism, racism, sexism, materialism, capitalism. But maybe, just maybe, the spirit of Anabaptism has something to say to us today in the midst of our ism fray. Is it a movement whose time has come? Is Anabaptism something we can learn from? 500 years ago, the Anabaptists died for their freedom to choose their faith. 500 years ago, the Anabaptists lived for the kingdom only to lose their lives. 500 years ago, the Anabaptists died for their political rebellion. 500 years ago, the Anabaptists lived out their salvation as best as they knew how. And now, 500 years later, what are we dying for? 500 years later, what are we living for? Thanks for watching and listening. If you are interested in this story, please check out my blog at www.garethbrandt.wordpress.com. If you'd like to host my exhibition of 15 watercolor paintings and storyboards, please contact me at my email address, garethbrandt61@gmail.com, and stand by for a book that will include my poetry, storyboards, and pictures, which will be published by Masthoff Press later in 2024. Thanks for watching and listening.